Welcome to another edition of Warmaster's Workshop. Today we're going to learn how to put together a Mandalorian armor knee cop. Um, the knee cop that we're building today is made out of plastic. We're going to be using 3mm expanded PVC foam board. Here in the US and maybe some parts of Europe, it may be called Sintra, but it is a PVC product. It's fairly easy to mold with heat. It doesn't require a huge amount of work to get it to look this particular shape, but it does require a little bit of work. I would say it's definitely an intermediate level project, hence why this specific tutorial falls in the 201 category. Now, many of you have probably seen knee plates done out of Sintra before. Um, I'm not sure the types that you have seen. Most of the ones that I see, very rarely are they in the more three-dimensional shape. They're usually flat, where someone has gently curved the sides and left the top completely flat. That's kind of I guess that's the getting by way to do it. But of course, there's a better way to do it to make it look like the way it looks in the movies. This particular this particular pattern and knee cup is the Boba Fett style, so it doesn't have the inside rim like a normal Jango Fett knee cup would have. I've actually got a fiberglass one here to show you. This is a Jango Fett style knee cup, and as you can see, it has a kind of a rim here on the inside. The Boba does not have that type of rim. It's open and just flat on the inside. It does have this bottom lip, however. It's just a little bit more subtle. It's not quite as mechanical looking as a Jango Fett knee cop is. The other difference is that in this specific knee cop that I have is that I have not built the dart launcher onto it. I don't personally build the dart launchers unless it's a custom request. It requires a lot more uh, fuel for the torch than the thing is worth, to be honest with you. It makes the knee heavy. The knee wants to sag. It's just I don't even think it really looks that aesthetically pleasing. Now that's my personal opinion. You can do it however you want to. That's just my opinion. But I'm going to set this finished cop over to the side so I can show you the pattern real quick and how we do that. Now this is the Wizard of Flight pattern. It consists of 5 pieces. You can find this pattern on the Mandalorian Mercs website in the templates and tutorial webpage. The web address is www.mandalorianmercs.org. But there are 5 pieces to this template. You have the center clamshell of the knee cop. You've got the outside, um, what some people call the dovetail or the outside wing, and then you've got the inside wing. Now the outside wing traditionally is bigger because this is where you put your dart launcher. The inside wing is smaller because it doesn't. The dart launcher would be kind of asinine to have a dart launcher on the inside of your knee. Um, the way I put this particular pattern together is that I put of course, the bottom portion of the knee as well is a separate piece. So I will tape together the bottom piece here, the little bottom lip. The bottom lip is what I will tape to the bottom. And then on the wings, since they're separate pieces, I'll kind of determine how wide the knee is going to have to be. If it's a wider knee, you can actually spread these wings out a little bit further. I like to try to keep them pretty close in towards the coppets or towards the clamshell of the cop because it just looks a little bit better. You can always work with this curve as we put it in to widen out the knee slightly so that it maybe fits a little more comfortable if you do have wider knees. But I like to keep this area a little high and tight just because, like I said, it does look better. Now, don't forget, too, that you can always resize these patterns in Adobe Reader before you print them. You can always play around a little bit and print a few different copies of the pattern out at different sizes to better to better fit the actual shape and size of your knee. Now the last piece to the pattern itself is what I like to call the upside down F, because it goes just like this. It's just like an upside down F. And then of course I always trim down this side so I can put it there as well, so it still has that little slightly plated look. But you can add that to both sides if you want, and not worry about the dart launcher, but it's a pretty versatile piece. Now if you do want to build the dart launcher, the Wizard of Flight Patterns actually comes with this piece, a secondary version of this piece to cut out to build the launcher on, and then you glue it. If you're using Sintra, you glue it to the top of this piece. So, like I said, if you wanted to go that route with a dart launcher, you definitely can. I choose not to. So we've seen the pattern. I'm going to go ahead and set it off to the side because we don't need to see it again. I have already, it's almost like a cooking show. I have already taken the liberty of pre-cutting another knee cup here, and I will show you what it looks like once it is cut out. Now I did cut this out of Sintra. I used an X-Acto knife or a razor blade knife. I will advise you with caution. Please wear a glove when you're cutting it out on the hand that you're holding it with. We don't need any cuts. I don't need anybody to be a Mando with a clipped wing because you didn't heed warnings to wear gloves. So make sure that you wear gloves. This is fairly easy to cut out with the X-Acto or razor knife, whatever you're using. It's fairly easy. It does take some time. It's not a quick cut. It does take a little bit of time. So just give yourself the time to do it, and it'll come out looking like this, fairly nice. Now we're still going to have to sand it when it's all said and done. So that, make sure you have your sandpaper and everything ready. If you need to take a look at your materials list that you're going to need, that's going to be, you can go back to the beginning of the video and take a look at that. But here's what our pattern is going, or what our finished cutout piece is going to look like before we get started on it. I'll spin it around so you can actually see how it looks. And then of course we have our little upside down F's for the side. Okay? So we're going to come back and we're going to start forming this bad boy up and see if we can't get this pair of knee cups done. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and start working on forming up our knee cup. We're going to primarily focus on getting in the nice side curves here. All those nice soft curves. So that's where that's what I'm going to show you now. And to do that, we're going to need our heat gun, of course. We're going to need our piece of our knee cup that's cut out in Sintra, and we're going to need a piece of PVC pipe that should be on your materials list. So make sure you go back and look. If you have any questions on that, it'll be in the list. So what we're going to do is we've got our heat gun set so that it's not all the way up on high, okay? And it's not going to be cool, obviously. It's a heat gun, but it's not set up on high because we don't want to scorch our plastic. This Sintra will scorch if you're not careful, and you'll burn it to the point where it's just brittle and it will just break apart. So we don't want to do that. So we don't want to set this too high, but we want to make sure it's high enough so that when we start molding it, we get the nice gentle, those nice curves. So let's go ahead and we'll go ahead and start up our heat gun and heat this up, and we'll just do it we're going to do one edge at a time, okay? So here we go. Always make sure you pay good attention to how your Sintra looks, because as it starts to get warm enough, the texture on the surface, and I'll hold this up, but I don't know if you'll actually be able to see it, but the surface texture is going to it's going to get kind of rough and wavy. All right. Yeah, and also remember too, you need to be in a decently ventilated area for this when you do it. All right, so now we just coax it over, just gently, just real gently like, just like that, and make sure you get that edge there, that tip. Okay. And if you need to, you can always work it out a little bit. I don't want to overwork it, so I work it out just a touch. So right there is our first bend. Okay. Oh, let me move it to where you can see it. See right there, nice subtle bend. Now we're going to do our other side. And the great thing about using the piece of PVC pipe is that it doesn't leave indentations from your fingers or any of that mess in there. And again, watch your surface texture. Hold it up there. I don't know if you can see it or not, but it'll start to get floppy. See how it's floppy? You'll start to see how it's starting to warp a little bit. That means it's hot enough. All right, and then again we put it on our PVC pipe and we just angle it around gently, very gently, very, very gently. You don't want to angle it. You don't want to do that bend too much. Okay. Now, if you see you've got a little bit right here, you can see how it looks. See how it's a little bit warped there. So what we're going to do is we're going to heat these sides up a little bit on the inside, and we're going to twist it back in line. You'll have to work with these things a little bit. I mean, you know, you're going to have to work with it a touch and make sure that you're getting it to look the way you want it to look. All right, so that part is looking good. Now, let's get this piece over here. We'll work the warp out of it a little bit. And you don't have to get it very hot. Just to the point where doing this is not a big deal. All right, now what we need to do is we've got both of our sides bent in, okay? They may not be perfect, but we'll get those. But we've got both of our sides bent in. So what we want to do now is add that little bit of curve here to the center. It's imperative that we add the center curve. Otherwise, I'll show you, we don't add the center curve. Here's the difference. With center curve, without center curve. Big difference. You got a flat knee versus a more form-fitting knee. So let's add the center curve in, and that's pretty simple as well. We just heat it up. All right. And then we take our hands here, and we just hold it till you get that little bit of curve going. Just a little bit of curve. Right there in the center. Still, it's getting there, but it's still a little bit flat. So let's heat it up again and add a little bit more curve. Just remember, don't overheat it. You can reheat this as many times as you want. You just don't want to overheat it. All right, so we're going to use our pipe this time, and we're going to just kind of go back and forth, almost like you're rolling out a piece of pie dough. All right. All right, so there we've got our curve. Now what we want to do, now that we've got our curve here, okay, so we're getting there. We're not there yet, but it's getting there. It's starting to look very similar. Pull this out a little more. So we're starting to look a little more similar. We're probably going to widen this out a little bit, but we'll do that. We'll do that here shortly. First, we're going to go ahead and heat up the bottom lip here and upturn it. Now I have a little trick that I use. I use a sheet metal seaming tool here. And once it's hot enough, I'll put it right on there. All right, and then I'll just bend it right up, and it'll just bend perfectly. Okay, and I'm going to show you exactly how that works. All right, seaming tool, and we upturn, just like that. And there you've got your here we go. Now you can see how it's upturned. All right, now we're gonna heat up these little teeth here, and we're gonna work them into these corners. Okay. We don't need the seaming tool for that. We can just use our fingers because this will not be super hot. All right, so now we just use our fingers here. We bend that down till it's nice and flush, just like that. Okay. I'll do the same thing to the other side. Again, you want to monitor this plastic. As soon as it starts to droop, that is when you want to start molding it. So now we've pushed this one in its proper place. We're going to let it cool down. You can blow on it a little bit if you need to get it to cool down, but it won't take it long to cool down. Now I'm going to heat these up just a little bit and pull a touch of the curve back out of it, just so that our knees are fairly even sized. There we go. Perfect. Perfect. So now when we compare, they're both just about perfect. Still doesn't quite have as much curve in it as the other one does, so we'll just keep heating it here till we get that curve in properly. The main thing is that you want it to match. I'm going to try to match the other one as much as possible. Yeah, I think that's going to be pretty good right there. All right. And I'd say that's pretty darn close. All right, so we've got our corners in. We've got our curve. It doesn't take long. Like I said, you just want to be patient. You want to work with it. Now, there may be, always look at them to see how your warpage looks. There's always going to be a touch of warp with plastic. All right, that's just the nature of the plastic. There'll be a little bit of a warp in it. There's not a whole lot you can do about it. What I normally do is that I will try to put the warp out of it by bending it down. I will heat and I'll kind of bend down this one. This one doesn't have any, but I'm going to go ahead and heat this one and just fix that warp slightly. And when I say warp, I just mean that one side is a little bit higher than the other. So it's an easy fix. You just heat it up and you pull it down. And then, of course, you can blow on it or whatever you need to do to get it to cool down. Or you can wait. There we go. And now our warp is out of it now. So, all right. Now, the next thing we're going to do with this, since we have the basic part of it done, is we're going to go ahead and we're going to epoxy, do our epoxy works. We're going to do our epoxy work next, and then we're going to work on getting the wings on the side, and then we will put in our little strap of metal for bracing, and we'll do our sanding, and then we should be ready to roll. All right, so now we're going to work on getting our bottom lip epoxied on, and we're also going to epoxy on the wings, the outer wing panels on the sides. What we're going to use is a 2-part 5-minute epoxy. So it's pretty simple. I like to use Q-tips because what it does is, as you're putting the epoxy on there, little threads of this cotton tip from the Q-tip actually get in there and bind with the epoxy, and it actually adds a little bit of extra support. Think about fiberglass. Think about how fiberglass chop strand works. Those strands kind of running all over the place at two or more different angles is what gives chop strand mat better support. So, or better support properties. So that's kind of what I'm doing here with these long cotton-tipped Q-tips. And you can use any type of Q-tip for this. I use these because they came out of an old scanner cleaning kit, and I've got tons of packs of these, and I use them for this and weathering. So pretty simple here. We're just going to run along right here the edge. And you want to really get a good amount in there because you want to fill that area up as much as possible so that you don't, that way you don't leave any places that could potentially snap. You also want to try to level it, or level those kind of trenched out areas there, because when you do, that makes it a lot easier to sand down nice and flat. So if it's a little bit high, that's okay. All right, now we're going to go ahead and hopefully you can see that. So now we're going to go ahead and I'm going to clip it at the back where there's the least amount of epoxy, so that I don't epoxy my I want to epoxy my clamp to it. That would not be good. Here I'm just trying to use every bit of spare epoxy that I've got already made up. Waste not, want not. If you don't waste it, then you won't run out. And these methods can be used for We need to mix some more up. This method can also be used for the 6mm Sintra just as well as the 3. So just don't think that because I'm using 3mm, none of this stuff will apply. It applies to 6 just the same. The only difference is you just need more heat, and you might need a little more force to bend the Sintra appropriately. Now, one thing you always want to make sure you do when you mix epoxy is really try to get that half and half ratio. If you don't mix enough hardener, then it's not going to get hard. It's not going to kick off, or if it does, it'll be really slow. If you mix in too much hardener, it's going to kick off too fast. So really try to get that 50-50 ratio down pat. It will just make your life a lot easier when using epoxy. The epoxy that I'm using is just a 5-minute epoxy. It's just kind of a generic brand. I don't think there's really a specific awesome brand, but I will suggest that you do stick with just using epoxy for this. I would not use a flexible adhesive like E6000 or Goop when it comes to this. I would stick with a tried and true epoxy because you need this to be as hard as possible. Alright, this might show up a little bit better. Let's see. There we go. Now you can kind of see how I've got that epoxy in there. I've got it laid up in there really well. So now I'm going to clamp the edge of this, and like I said, make sure it's the edge. What will happen is the clamp will get it in the right place here, and if you have any low spots there, just kind of work it in as best as you can. If you have to go back later and add a little more, you can. It's not a big deal, okay? It's not something that you have to stress. Yeah, this epoxy's already drying, so... Alright, so now let's work our way off to over to the wings. Always make sure you keep plenty of these Q-tips on hand. And when I do the wings, I make sure that I put the side that I marked on, that needs to go on the inside. That way you don't have any marks on the outside. Whenever you trace patterns on Sintra, oftentimes you might slip a little bit and leave a trench in the center. It's easy to scratch, so keep that in mind when you're using it, because if you have any scratches or any indentations, make sure those go on the inside first. Normally people would say, oh, well, that makes good weathering. And, it can make good weathering, but a lot of times those scratches and those divots, or, if you leave like a scratch or an indentation on there, sometimes those can lead to easy breaking. So we don't want to make this, allow this to break any faster than it should. So, and then what I'm doing here is I'm just putting the epoxy on the inside of the panel piece first. And you can probably see that some of that cotton is coming off in there, and that's good. That's what we want to see. And then it's pretty simple. We just stick it on here, line it up. If you've got more wing tab here than you've got, outer armor piece, that's okay. That's not a problem. We'll sand that off later. We'll have to sand these things down anyway. So for now, don't worry about that. It is not an issue. The main issue is getting this clamped on good, getting it as straight as you can on the get-go, so so that you don't have to deal with any fix-ups after the fact. So we got that side done, so let's move on over to this side. Before our epoxy dries, we don't want it to dry. Well, we want it to dry. We don't want it to dry while we're trying to use it, though. We want to make sure it kicks after we've got it in place. Now, one thing you want to be careful with is your clamps. Sometimes you'll get a clamp that's stronger than the others. It'll try to pull the piece that you're trying to clamp away. If that's the case, try to keep your clamps more towards the center. That'll really help keep that the pull down from happening if you keep those clamps in the center. Alright, so we're pretty tacky here. We can go ahead and take these clamps off and see if we need to add any more epoxy. This side is good. This side needs a little bit more on this edge right here. So let's set this down. I think we've used up all we can use out of that, so we'll mix up just a touch more. Not a lot, just a tiny little bit. A little bit of epoxy can go a long way if you use it correctly. You really want to try and take a good estimate of how much you're going to need. You also don't have to get the most expensive epoxy for this. I think the epoxy I'm using here was like a couple dollars. It's not expensive. I would tell you name brands. Actually, I'll tell you. They're not sponsoring this episode, but I'll tell you anyway. I'm just using Harbor Freight's epoxy. It works well. It's a good epoxy, to be honest with you. It's really good. They're 5-minute epoxy. I've had nothing but really good luck with that in the past, so I continue using it. All right, so I think that's all the epoxy we need to put on for now. And as you can see, all of our areas have been epoxied well. I've actually left a ridge of epoxy on it. And that's sunk in a little bit there. Let's see if I've got enough in here to... You really want to try to fill in these cracks, these seams. They're just seams. You want to try to fill these seams in with as much epoxy as possible. Because we're gonna sand it down anyway. So, all right, so there we go. Now all we got to do is let this dry, and once it's dried, we will go ahead and we'll sand it. I may or may not sand it on here. I'll probably sand some on here, and then I'm going to take it over to my drill press and finish sanding it up. But we'll sand it, and then we'll add the support band around the inside. We'll epoxy that in, and then we'll do whatever cleanup we need to do. Then our niche should be done. All right, so we've got all of our epoxied areas here sanded down. We've got our edges, and we've sanded those. Got those all nice and sanded down. Now, it's very important that you do sand down the edges on these knee plates, on any piece of Sintra armor, honestly. You need to sand these edges down so that they're soft, so that they're, rounded edges. Because Sintra, it can cut you. Sintra's fairly, it is a fairly sharp material. It will cut you. You don't want to get cut by it. I've been cut by a Sintra. It will slice through skin like a knife through, hot knife through butter. So you don't want to be in that situation, especially when you're in kit. You want to make sure that everything is nice and soft edges, and you will be completely good to go if you do that. So we've got our knee all epoxied together. We've got the edges all nice and sanded down. I'll show you here. You can tell that the corners here are rounded out. There are no sharp corners, no sharp edges. All these are nice and soft now. So now what we want to do is we want to put our metal band in. Now, what I'm using here is, I believe it's 26 gauge galvanized steel. I'm using galvanized steel in these because when you sweat, your perspiration is probably going to go through your flight suit and get on this support piece. By having it galvanized, the sweat will not will not cause oxidation on the piece. So you want to try to use something that's not going to oxidize. But basically, what this support piece does is you fit it inside here, okay? And we're going to epoxy it. I've already shaped it up, but it's pretty simple, especially with metal this thin. You can just shape it right up to the inside of the knee pad here. And we're going to glue it in there with some epoxy. And we're going to let it sit and harden up. And then we'll come back to it. And you can see exactly, you can see exactly how you should have your support strip, as I like to call it, your little metal support strip in there. And that strip will go a long way. If you have the thinner plastic knees like this, it's going to go a long way to keeping these knees from breaking. If you've got 6mm Sintra knees, more than likely they're not going to break, but it never hurts. It never hurts to put the support strip in, even on 6mm, because every little bit of help you can get when it comes to plastic, you want. Now, while that epoxy is mixed up there and about to kick, I'm just going to real lightly hit the inside of this with my sandpaper just to rough it up a bit. It doesn't have to be much. And then we just kind of go over it. And let me tell you, you don't want to be conservative when it comes to the epoxy for this strip. Nobody's going to see the inside of this knee plate anyway. So now is not the time to be conservative. Really make sure you get plenty of epoxy in there for this strip to sit on. If it doesn't come right up to the top edge, that's fine. It's not required by any means necessary. You just don't want it showing. You don't want it showing in the places where, like in the little jointed areas there between the wings. You don't want it showing there. All right, so here we go. We're going to place our support strip in there. Now we're going to clamp it in nice and tight like. And if you need to stretch it out a little bit, you can. Just make sure you don't pop your knees. Be real gentle anytime you do that. And now we want to put a couple clamps here in the front. Trying to get epoxy all over yourself. Cleaning that off is not fun. And then you get it all over your knee plate. And you got to clean it off of that. and then we got to sand that off. All right, so there we go with that. Let's set this up here like this and just check to make sure none of that middle strip is showing. It doesn't look like it is. I don't believe it is. Nope, I think we're good. Let's see if we have any of this left that hasn't kicked. Put some of this in the places where we've got a little bit of gap in the middle. This is where that cotton really comes in handy. It actually peels off here and then sticks inside there, and see, it helps those fibers actually help to epoxy that in. Now we're going to let that sit a bit. Now on this one, you're going to notice that I didn't put the metal all the way. It's not required. It's not required that that metal strip go all the way around, but I'm showing you both methods so you can decide what you want to do. On this one, it's pretty darn strong, even with just the two pieces in, and it's easier to form it up to fit the inside of the knee when it's separate pieces like that. But for now, on this one, we're going to do all one piece, and we're going to let that dry, and we'll come back, we'll see how it looks, and we'll do a little bit more epoxying to it because we really want to make sure that strip stays in and doesn't just pop out, okay? All right, so we've finished epoxying in our strip here off camera, but all we've basically done, and I'll hold this up so you can hopefully see it, is we've just epoxied around the entire edge of this knee cop here, right here. You can kind of see the, what I like to call the slag line of that epoxy, and we got a nice little lip right here, and right in this low area, or this separated area, we put quite a bit of epoxy in there. And on the ends, we put a little epoxy on each end so that it would stay on there nice and tight. And now the trick is just let it dry, let it sit overnight and set up. You're going to need to give this about 24 hours, even with 5-minute epoxy. 5 minutes just means it sets up, but it's not fully cured until normally 24 hours. So let it sit, let it sit out in your workshop or wherever, and finish curing. Once it's cured, then you're ready to go ahead and start painting it. And before you add your paint, I would hit it with a layer of either 80 grit or more than likely 120 grit sandpaper, just to get it a nice rough, smooth, a nice rough texture on the surface so that the paint can stick to it. With this being plastic, a lot of paint will want to just slide right off, and that's not good if that happens. So you want to make sure that you give a good texture for that paint to grab onto. And once that's done, once you've got it painted and weathered, then you're good to go. But that's pretty much it. The knees are not as difficult as they may seem to be. It's mainly just about patience and paying attention, and making sure that you've got all the tools that you need, and just patience, really. Patience more than anything. Rome wasn't built in a day, and I can guarantee you a pair of Mandalorian knee cops won't be built in a day either. So give yourself, I would say, start to finish on this project. If you build them both relatively at the same time, you can have them both done together in a couple days, maybe 3 if you're really having to wait on the epoxy. One thing I want to mention about epoxy: do not try to dry it fast using a heat gun or anything of that nature. All you're going to do is you're going to cause the epoxy to run. It won't kick off. It'll be too hot. You'll basically scorch the epoxy. Don't do that. Let the epoxy dry on its own time. Some corners can be cut, but that's not one of the corners that can be cut. So just remember that. And thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode of the workshop.